listening to the podcast Advertising Playbook, your resource to better understand and execute successful podcast ad campaigns. Hello and welcome to the podcast Advertising Playbook. I'm your host, Heather Osgood, and today I'm going to be talking to you about exclusivity and putting together good ad reads. These are two topics that have come up at True Native Media, where we represent podcasts and connect them with advertisers. And as different topics of discussion come up with our team, I always feel like it's great for me to share them with you here on the show. So first, I wanted to talk a little bit about exclusivity and what that means. So when you think about exclusivity, you have to think about it in the context of the type of ad read that you're doing. So because most of the ad reads are going to be host read, it's really important to make sure exclusivity is in place. And what that means is that you don't want to have competitors of similar products running within the same podcast. It would be pretty confusing for the audience if on one hand, you said, hey, this is the best supplement I've ever taken. It makes me feel amazing. And then 30 seconds later, you are saying the same thing about a competitive product. Now, that can be within a single podcast episode, but it also can be within a period of time, right? So if you're thinking about exclusivity, you might decide that having exclusivity within an episode could be okay, or it could be that you would want to extend that for a certain period of time. And what we see with exclusivity terms, that it can depend a lot on the type of product that is being advertised. So if it's a product that feels very personalized or a product that feels very specialized, then you're going to want to make sure that you have a cushion of some sort. And that may be that you don't want a competitor running within the time period that you're advertising. And it can also be that you don't want another competitor coming in even after your ads are finished running for, let's say, a 30-day period. Now, in those cases, typically you're going to have a right of first refusal or first right of refusal. People seem to say it different, but to that podcast, right? And so the idea would be that if there is a competitor that is wanting to advertise on the podcast, that you need to be checked in with first and given the opportunity to continue advertising as opposed to having a competitor come in and advertise. There can also be products where you're just looking for episodic separation. And what that means is that you don't want to have a competitor running in the exact same episode as you, but maybe it's okay for them to run in different episodes. And that might be the case when you're talking about, let's say, like a podcast promo, for instance. If someone's buying podcast promos on a podcast, maybe you don't want to have 3 podcast promos in one episode. You just want one podcast promo in an episode. Another one that we see this work well is different video game apps, right? If you're a video game app lover, you might decide that you want 10 video game apps, right? It's not out of question to say that you would get multiples and that you like lots of them. And that could even extend down into products like, maybe sheets or clothing, right? Like lots of people buy lots of different pairs of pajamas and lots of people buy multiple, sheet sets. Obviously, people buy clothing all the time. So it just depends on the type of product that you have. But it is really important to make sure that you have exclusivity outlined. Now, I know that I mentioned a lot of this is host read. And when we're talking about that host read endorsement piece, it is really important that you have exclusivity because it feels very inauthentic as the listener is being recommended products, right? Like maybe a little bit of whiplash. Last week you said this was great. Now this week you're saying something else, but a similar product. So that piece is important. But there's also the piece of programmatic ads, and you don't want competitors to be running with programmatic ads either. And so as we're seeing an increase in these announcer-read programmatic ads that are being inserted into podcasts, it's really important that you know that those podcast ads are being categorized correctly and that you as an advertiser are being submitted with within your correct category so that we aren't having that where we've got competitive advertisers running within a podcast. And I will say that most of the ad delivery platforms do a nice job with categorization as long as that ad was set up and categorized correctly. So you might recall my conversation with Mattia from Spreaker recently at South by Southwest. We talked about the new technology that they have where AI is going through all of their ads and then categorizing them appropriately. They also have someone on site that is manually going through any questionable copy. So there are technologies being put in place to really help mitigate against an ad being categorized incorrectly so that the hope is that competitors are not being run back to back. So just make sure that you are thinking about all of those things within a podcast for exclusivity. Now, you may also decide, depending on the type of campaign that you're purchasing, that you want this exclusivity to extend out into things like their social and their YouTube or other elements that they're creating. So as a content creator, if they are on their Instagram saying, hey, this meal kit is the best one ever, and then they're on their podcast saying, hey, this is the best one ever, that can also create a level of confusion within the audience that is not going to be great. I know a recent report said that about 50% of someone's social following is likely to be listening to their podcast. And so, if you think about the crossover between platforms for that content creator, it's important to look at how exclusivity is extending out into that content creator, period. And so I don't believe any of the contracts that have come across our desk have specified that. I really should double check that. I'm not 100% sure because I'm not the person that does all the contract reviews, but that's an important piece, right? Like we do need to be looking at that and seeing how exactly is exclusivity being determined, and especially as we're seeing more and more campaigns that are more integrated beyond just the podcast, but into the entire content. It's important for us to look at that exclusivity piece across all content. So if you're someone who is doing ad buying, please make sure that you are considering that. All right, next I wanted to talk about talking points. So talking points are the items that advertisers are giving to the podcast host to create the ad. I've said it recently and I'll say it again. Host-read ads are amazing on so many levels, but one of the things that I do find a bit tricky is that depending on who the host is, often we're taking someone who knows nothing about marketing and asking them to put together an ad read, right? So it seems in many situations that we're taking the least qualified individual and we're saying, hey, I work for an advertising agency. I know everything about creating ads. And then we're taking a brand who has a marketing department that knows everything about marketing and creating successful ads. And then we're giving it to someone who knows nothing about creating successful ads. And we're saying, hey, why don't you create an ad read for me? And so I do think that can be tricky for us. That's why having good talking points is so, so important. Now, I will also say that ideally, we don't want to script the ads because we are leaning into this host-read endorsement piece, and we're also leaning into that content creator. And one of the things that we try to communicate to our content creators is that the ad is just another piece of content. And so if you're not going to put the effort into the ad like you are into the rest of the content, then it's going to make your show sound bad. And ideally, they're addressing this ad as a 60-second piece of content for their podcast instead of just as an ad read. So we want to give that host the freedom and flexibility to create an ad that is going to resonate with their audience. And they do know their audience better than anyone because they're the ones that create content for them. The audience is used to hearing them, hearing their voices, and they know what they can do in terms of how they can resonate with their audience. So we want to make sure that we're not giving scripts to hosts because we want them to say it in their own voice. The other thing that I think is important is that podcast listeners listen to a lot of different podcasts too. And so if you are a podcast listener, which I am assuming you are since you're listening here, you have had that experience where you have listened to a podcast and heard an ad for a product. And then you have heard that product advertised on many other podcasts, and the ads all sound pretty much the same. Then what that means is that that company is giving very restrictive talking points. And essentially, their message is being limited because the advertiser is saying you have to say these things, and there isn't that availability for creativity. So I really think it's important to make sure that you're not scripting ads. I do think it's really important to make sure you're sampling products with the host and that your samples are getting to the host in enough time that they can create a good ad read. I would say if we have one chief complaint with product samples, it's that the product arrives to the host after the ads have started, or in some cases after the ads have finished, right? And so it's not as effective because the host hasn't had the chance to really enjoy the product. And I know we all get in tight timelines. Everyone wants to turn things around as quickly as possible. But I do think it's important for us to consider how the campaign is going to be delivered if the host doesn't have the product. So having the product is really, really important. The other thing that I recommend is that you include a sample ad read from a campaign that performed really well. So if you've got one host that just did a killer ad read, it converted super well, that's a good thing to give the host that's creating this ad read for you, because they can listen. They can hear how this other host put the ad together and they can take some of that. One consideration though, when we have asked for ad samples from advertisers, sometimes we'll be given really long ad reads. And that always makes me concerned, because if the podcaster has sold you a 30 or a 60-second ad read, but then you send over a 5-minute ad read for them to compare it to, there's going to be a disconnect, right? Because the host is thinking, wait, I can't. Like, how am I supposed to get this 5 minutes into 60 seconds? And I would say most podcasters don't stick to the actual 30 or 60 seconds, right? Like, this isn't radio. They're going to go over in most cases somewhat. A lot of them aren't going to go 5 minutes. And I would also say that in many cases, having a longer ad read can be worse and not better. So those are just important things to think about. But giving a sample ad read can be really good. The next thing is encouraging them to give that personal experience, right? So I mentioned making sure that you get the product to them in time, but that comes with this idea that the host is going to talk about what it's like to use that product and how important it was for them and their life. I also really love it when hosts can tie the product back to the potential topic of the show, right? I've heard hosts do that many times, and I think that that's really interesting. As you're sending over the talking points, also be very aware of the volume that you're sending to the host. Again, we are asking these people who are not marketers to put together a solid ad read for us. And if you give them far more than they could actually get into an ad read, then you're leaving all of this discernment on their plate to go through and pick out the pieces that are actually really the most important things to say or the most important product to talk about. And so if you've got multiple products, then if that host orders one product, they should have the talking points for the product that they received, right? You don't want to give the host so much that they can't figure out what to say. So make sure that you're not giving them too much. The next thing is that you should make sure that you've got a really strong call to action. So if you've got a direct response campaign that you're working on, you're looking to see actual conversions, then you have to make sure that there's a call to action in that ad read that's going to prompt someone to purchase the product. I've talked about it before, and I will say it again and again and again. One of the big challenges with calls to action is that when we're talking about any sort of online purchasing, every website on the planet is going to have some sort of an offer on their website. That is just marketing basics, right? And so the challenge is that when that consumer goes to your site and there's a pop-up or there's a header or something that is promoting an offer, it is very convenient for that consumer to just go ahead and take that offer, right? they are not thinking, oh, wait, if I don't use that right promo code, then I'm not going to give credit to this podcaster, right? Like that is not on their minds. They are not thinking that. So you have to make sure that the offer that is happening on the website isn't better than the one that you're giving in podcasting. And also, it's not a bad idea to make it different in some respects. And I would recommend that if you have an offer on your website that is a certain percentage, but you're giving a higher percentage off for the promo code, then in the talking points, you should say something to the effect of, first-time customers normally get 30% off, but if you use this promo code, you can get 40% off, right? So calling those things out to the consumer so they say, oh, wait, there's a greater savings if I use this code than if I use what's on the website. So just being really aware of the calls to action. And then as you're thinking about the calls to action, realizing that there is going to be traffic that's going to come to the site that maybe isn't going to use your promo code. So you should always have some sort of a multiplier that you're using as you're thinking about the results from a campaign. And then also, it's not a bad idea to create a landing page that maybe is going to direct traffic to a specific landing page instead of just using a promo code. And then third, if results are number one, I would really recommend that you're using some sort of a pixel to track the results because that's going to be really helpful. Calls to action are really important for direct response campaigns, so make sure you have that dialed in. And lastly, if you've got a campaign that is going to be running for a while, you want to make sure that you're changing out your talking points often enough that the host can come up with creative ad reads. We certainly have had many situations over the years, especially with longer term campaigns, where the host will receive a set of talking points at the beginning of the year, and maybe they don't get new talking points for 6 or 7 months. And we're asking this host to come up with a new ad concept every month. But depending on how restrictive these talking points are, it could be really difficult to come up with a new ad read because if I have to say these 5 things and I've got a 60-second ad, like how much freedom and flexibility is that giving the host? Or how many new ideas is it giving the host? If it doesn't have like a new sense about it, some way to generate some new concepts for that host to create something new and interesting, then it's going to be difficult for them to come up with a new ad read. So refresh your talking points on a regular basis. It's going to make a big difference in the quality of that ad read that's going to come out. We encourage our hosts to change up their ad reads as often as possible, really, because we know that once we're on like the 5th or 6th or 10th, right, time that you're hearing an ad, you're going to tune it out. So making sure that we have fresh ad reads is really important. I hope that this has been informational for you today. Exclusivity and talking points are 2 really important topics when you are putting together a podcast ad campaign. If you're interested in learning more about podcast advertising, don't hesitate to head on over to truenativemedia.com. We certainly have resources there and would be happy to talk to you about creating a successful podcast ad campaign. Lastly, if you haven't checked out my YouTube, head on over there. Great content for you on YouTube. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you again next time. Thank you for listening to the Podcast Advertising Playbook, your source to a better understanding of the podcast advertising industry.